Yes, yes.
Okay, yeah, you got everyone was muted, so.
I was trying to unmute it with my space bar and it wasn't working.
Oh, okay. I'm going to very briefly go over some concepts just to understand what all of us are going to be talking about. So I hope I don't take too long with this. So I just wanted to explain that what pragmatic competence is: the linguistic and sociocultural knowledge of what forms to use, what concept, in what context, the ability to use the knowledge in a flexible, adaptive manner, and the agency. Now, I just like to always put this in because, again, if you are armed with the knowledge, then you can choose whether or not you want to use it. If you don't want to use an L1 norm, that's your choice, but you need to make that choice, not because it's a mistake on your part. Okay, so I thank you very much, Han. Just covered this basically so we could divide pragmatic competence into pragmalinguistic, which is again usually what we think of as more of the grammatical, the linguistic side of that, and the socio-pragmatic, which is associated with the situational, culturally and socially appropriate use of the norms that underlie the language. So, for example, let me see, maybe this, okay. So for example, now pragmatic transfer. Now, it used to be divided into positive transfer and negative transfer. There's really not a positive transfer. It just means if it's positive, that means that you are using the appropriate L1 norms. So pragmatic transfer is generally associated with something negative. So it's when you are transferring the your L1 knowledge to an L2 context inappropriately. So I just want to give an example, like for example, of a pragmalinguistic transfer. Excuse me 1 second while my voice comes back. So for example, if we're talking about requests, I'm sorry, just give me 1 minute. Okay, so if you're making a request and you use the wrong word to make a request. So for example, instead of saying the word could, you use the word may. Okay, so that would be in a pragmalinguistic transfer. Socio-pragmatic transfer might be when you are with a friend, or excuse me, when you are with someone you don't know and you say, give me the book, not understanding that it's the wrong power distance. You should be more polite with a someone who you don't know. So basically, okay, your grammatically is okay, but you are using the wrong L1 norm in that situation. So here are some challenges. Even L2 learners with high grammatical competence may not acquire pragmatic competence. Why? Just being exposed to the concepts does not ensure learning. It has pragmatic functions are often not salient, the professor's favorite word, even after prolonged exposure. Even you might just not notice it because it's part of the background of whatever you're doing. And some pragmatic features cannot be learned without instruction or only after acquired very slowly. Also too, there are some pragmatic universals, but we don't, a lot of times students to know which ones. Students need to know which universals there are, but maybe so what they have is L1 knowledge of pragmatic universals, but they don't know how to apply them to their L2. And then they may not be aware of those that are not universal. Okay, so one of the dangers is that they are more likely to assume certain norms, pragmatic norms are universal when they are not. And that results in transfer. Another thing is that classroom instruction is essential, but it's not enough. There also has to be outside instruction. So I don't know if Deanna touches on this, but even if you give classroom instruction, students need to get instruction outside the class. So teachers would do well to assign them homework, for example, pragmatic homework. So I know I'm going to, okay, the solutions, identify which pragmatic features are universal and how to apply them, teach non-universal to concepts, integrate pragmatic instruction at all levels. Even at the lowest levels, the least proficient learners can be taught pragmatic instruction, and provide explicit instruction, which I'm going to talk about very quickly because I know I'm out of time, because the explicit instruction makes pragmatic functions and features salient. So that's why explicit teaching is, just very quickly, explicit instruction is providing direct metapragmatic explanation followed by focused practice. Implicit instruction does not provide metapragmatic explanation, but tries to develop implicit understanding by using techniques that doesn't explain it, but just giving a lot of examples, using a certain word a lot in class. So I'm going to very quickly use an example of a study that was done. This was a study of advanced English language students in a German high school. And here is just to outline the implicit version. The implicit group, they were just just extensive conversational practice, and there was tapes of their language that they listened to. The explicit version provided, I'm sorry guys, give me 10 seconds till my voice comes back.
Okay, I can kind of like read through it for you. So explicit version with explicit meta-pragmatic information concerning the use and the function of routine provided orally. Provision of handout containing explicit meta-pragmatic information. Students listen to tape of their own language behavior and auto-feedback elicited, linking observed performance to meta-pragmatic awareness.
Thank you. My voice is back. Just to let you know, if you read the study, I mean, this was major meta-pragmatic information given to these students. So it's not always feasible, but so here is my last slide because I'm scared I'm running out of time, but here's some findings and conclusions, okay? No, spoiler alert, the explicit group had less traumatic pragmatic transfer. And this is what I found really, it wasn't just that they didn't make mistakes, but they improved in terms of their speech acts were more varied. Should be the word in more varied speech acts and more varied contexts. Sorry about that. And the other thing I found was the explicit group, they were able to say, hey, this was really, really useful. This really taught us when and why we in the past transferred L1 knowledge inappropriately. Like just quickly, they said, now we understand why when we spoke to people native English speakers why we sounded rude, because in German, we make requests more forcefully. And so they learned when and why they had engaged in pragmatic transfer and how to avoid it by identifying it, replacing it with L2 expressions and norms. And here are some general conclusions overall. Metapragmatic information essential in avoiding pragmatic transfer and in promoting more use of very pragmatic functions. And also essential is practice after providing the information. You need both. And the final thing is, and I talked about this before, even with classroom instruction, it's not enough. There aren't enough hours in the day. You have this, they had to, L2 learners have to get practice outside of the classroom. Okay, so, and then that's all, folks. Any questions? No?
Okay, thank you so much. So again, like Elaine talking about the meta-pragmatic awareness. So meta-pragmatic awareness kind of like like a mindful reflection on the processes of meaning generation and meaning construction. And basically she advised that we need to think of how to teach it explicitly. And there are some, example how to teach it explicitly, like let the student observe how the conversation is going among native speaker, and then give explicit feedback on the processes of meaning generation. Okay, if you have questions for the speaker, you can also send them to my chat box. Okay, but yes, thank you, Elaine. Elaine is really like on time. So if you see like I signal with this like ta-da, is mean like okay, it's time's up, but I think everybody is on track now. So for next we will listen to Deanna. So Deanna will talk about continue to talk about other strategy to incorporate pragmatics into language teaching. Okay, Deanna, please continue.
Sure. So this has been a really interesting class, and I think one of the big questions we're going to walk into as we walk out of this course is how to distill and translate these ideas into the daily language classroom. And one of the things that keeps coming back to me when I consider how to do this is how to go about making a more explicit concerted effort to dedicate time to pragmatic acts. Something which I've observed in my own language instructors doing, but often in a tangential way on an as-needed basis. So consider this example. This is a story I got from a classmate who was in a different instructor section for Japanese. My peer asked who can use ore and who can use boku and when, which are just two different pronouns, but they mean the same thing, it's I. The instructor put ore and boku into different contexts. The man who uses boku uses both hands when driving a car. A man who uses ore has one hand on the wheel and one arm around your shoulder. And I can think of a ton of examples like this where a lesson on pragmatics, and by extension, what's rude based on context, becomes a tangential etiquette lesson, usually only appearing when a student asks a particular kind of question when it comes up. So Professor Kekshke has recommended that we be provocative with these presentations, and I'd like to throw down the gauntlet. Why not have a rude section? Like a rude minute. Utilize activities that at least once a class or once every other class actively encourage students to practice impolite speech. We cannot be selective about teaching a language if we're really going to teach it in a way that imparts some measure of true communicative abilities. It's a part of pragmatics and culture. Therefore, teach them how to wield it effectively, because there are times when it's called for just as much as anything else. Excuse me can mean, I'm sorry for bumping into you, excuse me. But it can also mean, excuse me, I'm sorry, what did you say? And that's a powerful intonation to have under your belt, even if it's not to personally use it, but to aid in interpretation. I found a paper by Gerard Mugford, which was titled, How Rude, Teaching Impoliteness in the Second Language Classroom, that supports my point. Mugford argues that Impoliteness is a part of everyday language use, and L2 users need to be prepared to interact in impolite situations, and that students have the communicative right to be rude if they want to, as long as they are aware of the consequences of their actions. So by not teaching impolite language, we're almost straitjacketing students into cheerful, formal, polite modes of communication. And when we talk about different expressions of personality in bi and multilinguals, I can't help but wonder if how much of that is because, at least in classroom language learning, we studiously avoid teaching impolite language as a communicative tool as much as we do with formal registers. And a big part of that is underlining to students what we've been learning about in this class, that there's often a difference between what the utterance says and what it actually communicates. We need to create opportunities that don't focus on compositional meanings, but give greater chances to think paralinguistically. We know context does not decide meaning, but we cannot give students a foolproof Bible on exactly when someone is being impolite, but we can at least make an effort to increase exposure and therefore salience so that students are able to more competently make those calls on their own. In the article by Mugford from 2008, he did something that I thought was very interesting. He took an emic approach and asked the L2 users in his study to recall and reconstruct target language encounters involving impoliteness. So what they've experienced personally. And he popped the answers into 4 categories in order to analyze the information. So there are instances of individual politeness, which is where the hearer perceives a personal attack, social impoliteness, which is where the hearer perceives an attack on their social role, cultural impoliteness, which the hearer perceives as an attack on their ethnic group, and banter, which is the playful use of impolite language. And to be honest, I think his categories are a little messy. I'd argue that individual, social, and cultural impoliteness are kind of collapsible. If I'm being attacked for my ethnicity versus my social role, I'm still going to perceive both of those attacks as being quite personal. They both make up, how I personally perceive myself. But he states that the categories are helpful for differentiating between particular instances of what are like unique and opportunistic versus what's systematic and recurring. So someone insulting your outfit coordination of the day versus someone insulting you on the basis of your ethnicity or your physical features. And what was interesting is that the respondents apparently had an easy time recalling when they experienced impoliteness. And we know it's not as though acquiring an L2 means we acquire an entirely new pragmatic system. We have the ability to discern when we're being insulted or mistreated. It's just the idiosyncrasies and the missed subtleties which are baked into every language and culture that I'm thinking of when I suggest teaching impoliteness in the classroom. So users that reported individual impoliteness in these studies remarked that the unexpected contextual spontaneity of the remarks left them unable to reply. And this is coming from L2 users who also self-identified as knowing how to be rude in English. So in the instances of social impoliteness, like in shop situations or at customs and immigration sort of setups, they responded to the impolite acts, but they leaned on excessive politeness and justification in order to counter the rudeness. And what I want to interject before I continue talking about this paper is that it's not only L2 users who struggle to respond to impoliteness, and these strategies are 100% also used by native speakers. I will often deflect with excessive politeness or justification when I feel I've been insulted, but, all caps, I find I respond in these ways for personal reasons, not because I'm caught off guard and have no other recourse at all. The idea of l'esprit de l'escalier is an affliction in all languages, that phenomenon where we think of the perfect comeback to someone's rudeness just a little too late. I don't think that there's any amount of training in the classroom or even out of it that will develop a perfect strategy for coolly shutting down face-threatening acts, but I think it's healthy to give L2 learners an opportunity to practice responding to and even employing face-threatening acts in a controlled space. So if they find themselves in a situation and they have the presence of mind to choose between one strategy of de-escalation with over-politeness or justification versus blatant response, they will actually have a choice on their hands, and it will not be a predetermined pragmatic decision. Some of the teachers who responded to Mugford's study argued that L2 users should not engage in impolite practices, even though they need to identify them. It's also not their job to teach impoliteness. It's too difficult. Teaching impoliteness promotes conflict. I think not teaching impoliteness, so skirting around the issue, encouraging overly positive and formal language in the classroom, promotes conflict. Everyone in the language textbook is smiling and has easily resolved problems by the end of a dialogue, and this is egregiously not true to life, and we do a disservice to students by not addressing it and painting a pristine pragmatic landscape. I told Han that my topic was going to be on how to incorporate pragmatics into the language classroom. So what I've recommended here is to bring it in with an engaging and provocative topic that is useful and necessary for communication, impoliteness. As to how to actually implement it, what I think is a wonderful way is to encourage students to recall and reconstruct impolite moments they've encountered and discuss it with the class. Identify what phrase was used that made the interaction impolite. Is it a common phrase that usually means something polite, but the intonation altered the pragmatic meaning of it? One of the things that Mugford mentioned is the idea of modifying existing textbook exercises. So change up a line and make it impolite. Allow the student to respond to a surprising, spontaneous change in what they expect. And we can provide, therefore, more inductive opportunities for students to try to pick up on cues in a controlled environment. I was skimming over a paper from Amanda Hilliard about how to teach pragmatics of complaining to L2 learners. And one thing that I noticed was in her examples, the L2 learner is always the aggressor. And I understand why, because we assume that they lack the proper training to complain properly. But what about when they are aggressed against? If you teach a situation where you have to properly complain to a server in a restaurant, and then in real life, the server pops off at you, do you steam ahead or do you adjust your communicative strategy to either deflect their impoliteness or challenge it as is your right, if that is the most appropriate act for who you are and what the situation is? Soft power with pragmatic language is only one strategy. And sometimes by overemphasizing over politeness or deflection or justification, we may end up kicking the legs out from under a person seeking to make a legitimate complaint using the full force of their feeling, so long as they understand what outcomes such language can lead to. If you are given a phrase like, I'm a vegetarian, but you brought me a burger, to make a complaint, and the server responds with, well, I can bring you a new one, but you'd have to pay extra. What polite recourse do you have? Perhaps this is a situation for moderately impolite response. That is unacceptable. When you have to advocate for yourself, sometimes soft power is not the only type of pragmatic act that you can rely on. We can incorporate pragmatics into the language classroom by incorporating the whole of it. Any discomfort that we feel as teachers, we need to work through and figure out a solution for, because our students should not be bereft of any resources that they may need in the real world outside of our language drills and our role plays. So that's what I have to say on it. I'm open to any questions or confrontations.
Okay. So first, questions from the audience.
For some reason, while you were talking, all I could think about was, you remember that Saturday Night Live skit where Obama had an anger translator? I keep thinking of, if there could be, we could express what's really in our heads, behind the polite facade. So,
I mean, with my presentation, I'm not seeking to say that we shouldn't bother teaching politeness, but I think there's very much a difference between teaching how to be polite and also teaching how to effectively be impolite at the same time. We can't assume that just because we've taught how to be polite, therefore people have an understanding of what it means to be impolite and how to effectively engage with that kind of language. I just believe there should be more of a balance.
Yeah, I totally can relate, because it's like we talk in class about, communication is not just always smooth and successful, right? But it can also fail and cause a lot of misunderstanding. Yeah, thinking about 6 years that I live in the United States, if the communication is fail, I think that would result in awkwardness, embarrassment, and I don't know, what the strategies in order to resolve the situation. So I feel like you touch upon one aspect of pragmatic knowledge that we talk about at the beginning is the psychological meaning, the affective factors, and of course, specifically the impoliteness, teachability. So I think it's very important, and I think it's a new topic, like it's an untouched area. In order to kind of design a task to implement in a classroom setting, and then you suggest like just have a session where have 1 minute of rudeness and how to psychologically prepare, mentally prepare the student for that. Have you actually actualized that kind of idea in the Japanese classroom?
No, God, no.
I think
Andy.
that this idea isn't just a small little mini lesson. This is a whole course. This is a textbook.
Exactly.
Because you're right. Everything that you've touched upon is completely accurate. We're leaving students completely open to be taken advantage of without having any way to advocate for themselves. Being rude is a natural part of all human interactions. And if we're not setting the kids up to do it right, then they're not going to do it right. Someone's going to tell them off in the street and they're going to, oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I hit you with my car. Or I'm sorry your car hit me.
Right.
You know, instead of saying, hey,
I'm walking
I think it's
here.
brilliant.
Yeah.
What the fuck? You just
Yeah.
rolled into me. God damn it.
Yeah.
I'm calling the cops.
And I think it's better to do it in the classroom, or at least to try to start in the classroom, because otherwise they will, people are not idiots. L2 learners are not idiots. They're going to learn how to express impolite language. They're going to figure out their own way of doing it, and either by taking statistics, watching how other people are impolite and folding it into how they communicate, or just coming up with their own new way of impolite that just is kind of maybe unreadable to some, but is still their way of expressing themselves. But if we can say, like, you know, in the appropriate situation, this is how you be impolite to this kind of person. And there are different registers of impolite. There's being impolite to your professors when you're annoyed with them. There's being impolite to your colleagues when you're frustrated with them. There's like, and it's still appropriate, even though it's not polite. And I agree with you, Andy. I think that like an entire course dedicated to this is a fabulous idea, but for lack of a course like that, at least trying to incorporate every single class, just a little bit of chance for that part of your brain, I think the id, that like just wants to get out and start conflict. I think it's good in terms of preparing them. And also I think it makes the class a little bit closer. It's a little bit more of a chance to just honestly communicate with one another in all of the different ways that you exist as a person. And I haven't had a chance to implement it in my Japanese class. Just when I was learning, I haven't taught yet, but I think that I'd really want to include just a chance to like, just let it out. You know, it's like getting out the shakes or the shouts or whatever, you know, when you're dealing with little kids in kindergarten or something. You have to give them a wild minute.
Well, it's kind of like what I said last time in my presentation. I feel like politeness and impoliteness is kind of universal in the sense of culture. So like whatever we have been brought up to think that's impolite or polite depends on what we grow up to, like, no. So it's a good thing to tell students what is out there and what might be something that might be impolite in this new culture, in this new world. So I get what you're trying to say, which
and
like
teach them how to use it, and teach them how to use that impoliteness, not just like
So
just identify it.
Yeah, because like personally, like I said last time in my presentation, I didn't understand a lot of the concepts of being polite or impolite until I went out there and actually spoke the language myself and got to know people outside of the school, because no one actually showed me like I feel like sometimes as language teachers, we want to like just talk about the grammar and talk about like the actual concept of the language, but we forget about the cultural aspect of what these people are going to go into. I don't know. That's what I thought.
thank you. So, but I think, Diana, you want to make a clear distinction a little bit again, right? Like, it's not just only, it's more like not emotional explosion for the kids to use with the language, but also how to control and deliver it in a way that comprehensible to the interlocutors, right? So it's a way to manage and control emotion, but also to, so it's, I think that's resonate with what Abraska said, but I feel like, yes, I would pick it off, you know, from a language that from the street, you pick up like, you know, taboo language, or the way that to express emotion with language, or through film, to media. But, you know, in a classroom setting, of course, the teachers need to orchestra, the teachers need to conduct the exercise in a manageable and kind of civilized way, right?
Oh yeah,
So
100.
I think impoliteness is difficult to teach than politeness. So do you
So
have
as a college student, I think that
So
the way
wait.
that they did was debate. I think debate might be a good way to show politeness and
Well,
class. I'm sorry.
the issue is I'm not just interested though in disagreement.
Mm.
I'm not just interested in how to, because debate is how to politely disagree and drive home your point. I'm talking about when you need to actually do an FTA yourself. So one of the things that was brought up in the paper that I read was talking about like customs, right? So you dealing with a customs officer who's being unbelievably rude to you, like, come on, lady, move it along, blah, blah, blah. You shouldn't have to just have the tools to respond to that, being like, oh, sure, sorry, or like, I'll be there in a moment. You should be able to be like, I need a moment. You need to stop. Don't shout at me. Something that like actually responds to the level, which adequately expresses your feelings in a more like in a more authentic way.
Yeah, and that's
I don't know if the
resonate with
customs.
what you say with linguistic
kind of scares me
register.
as a
I don't
non.
Yeah,
have the devices like that. Yes.
I don't know if you've ever been taken to the back room of an airport
I mean,
after dealing with a customs official. It's scary. It's
scary.
fucking
Andy,
terrifying.
that's fair. What I mean,
I don't think we should. That's a terrible example.
what I mean
Dan,
though
everything else, I'm like following you. I'm going to vote
Yeah.
for you for president. That was
Yeah.
brilliant. Except for the customs part,
well,
you're going to go
so
to jail.
what I mean, and rather than the customs part, I guess what I'm trying to say is when you're speaking to authority, when you're speaking to people who are somehow above you in a social role, in a way that is not just subordinating yourself, if
So what
it's
I-
appropriate. So not necessarily customs, but maybe like when you're dealing with, I don't know, some
Power
administrative
distance,
official who's being dismissive
general.
of you,
Yeah.
and not just taking it lying down. Just because, not because you're saying you should do this or like this is the proper way. This is just what you can do. This is your choice. You have a toolbox of ways to respond, and you're going to respond in whatever way that you see fit in the moment. I'm not going to be able to control them when they're talking to someone, but I can at least show them like this is the impolite way. If you're going to be impolite, that's how to be impolite.
Yeah.
That it makes sense, but I have seen non-native speakers be in the situation, and I feel like the only way they feel comfortable is to have a native speaker. So for example, my mother knows English and she learned to speak English. So like she was trying to advocate for my sister who has an IEP. So she was basically being dismissive because like she's just this Puerto Rican lady that doesn't know how to like speak proper English. So she had to take my friend who's a white boy from Rochester to actually go there and speak for her. You know what I mean? So I feel like they need to be in that situation and they need to like be with a person that knows the language for them to then feel comfortable and be like, okay, so this is how I have to handle these things. Because it's just it's a scary world to not be fully comprehended.
So, okay, so I think we need to wrap up that topic right now so that we can continue with our class. But I feel like the idea that Diana put forward can start with introducing some very unfamiliar or awkward situation or impolite situation like that into your classroom and equip your student with enough linguistic register and also, like she said, the cognitive processing procedure for them to exercise so that help them to kind of function, not just function well, but also function in the most authentic way that's still them, but fluent in a second language. It's so very important as well. Okay, thank you, Diana. So next, Katie will help us to come back to some realities of incorporating pragmatic into classrooms. So she will elaborate on some challenges that the teachers encounter when trying to incorporate pragmatics into the classroom setting. Okay, Katie, welcome.
Yeah. So I know that's what I originally said I was going to do, but I kind of took a different approach. It's also more based on personal experience rather than academic. So yes, I have a presentation. I'll share my screen. screen. Okay. No. Sorry. For some reason, I can't share my screen when I go into full. Okay. So can pragmatics be taught in the classroom? There's this debate after I was looking at a few articles about should pragmatics be taught in the classroom. And I think that after this course, everyone, I'm going to assume everyone would agree that pragmatics should be taught in the L2 classroom. But why is it difficult and how can you accomplish this? So let's go. There was this one definition of pragmatics that I found that I came across that I really like. So pragmatics is the study of communicative action in its sociocultural context. Communicative action includes not only speech acts such as requesting, greeting, and so on, but also participating in conversation, engaging in different types of discourse, and sustaining interaction in complex speech events. So the personal experience I'm going to talk about is learning Spanish as a second language and also teaching English, but in a foreign language environment. So not necessarily teaching English like as a second language here in the United States. So learning Spanish, I studied maybe 3 years in high school. And then I spent the required 1 semester in undergrad. But I wasn't interested in learning Spanish at the time, and I had no desire to learn. And keep in mind that, so my high school teachers and my college professor, they were all non-native Spanish speakers and had maybe only 1 semester or maybe 1 year abroad in a Spanish-speaking country. So before I start, I would like to ask this question, and Abrashka, I'm gonna ask you to refrain because you are a native Spanish speaker. But how do you say I'm sorry in Spanish? Does anyone have it? Okay, yeah. So that's what I was taught as well, lo siento. So that's what I figured it was. So when I moved to Colombia, and I think, I don't know if I mentioned it in this class, but I know Elaine touched on it. I tend to say I'm sorry all the time, you know, for little things like, for example, if you were on mute, I'd say, oh, I'm sorry, you're on mute. Or if I bumped into you, I would just say, oh, I'm sorry. So that kind of transitioned over into my Spanish that I was using in Colombia. I would say, oh, lo siento, lo siento. And one day I was late for work and I worked at a school and it was kind of early on. And I came into the class and I apologized. I was like, lo siento to the students and to the teacher. And they all kind of giggled. And then it was kind of passed and they were like, don't worry about it. And later after the class, the professor pulled me aside and he said, Katie, you know, in that situation, I wouldn't really use lo siento. I would say que pena, which literally translates to what a pain. He said, that's what we kind of use in, you know, these situations. And we only really use lo siento if it's a serious type of thing. So another example that I had was with this. So would anyone know how to say excuse me in Spanish? It's kind of a cognate of another word that we use, like pardon me.
Oh, I would say perdón.
Yeah, perdón. So that's what I assumed too. And I kind of just figured that it would be, you know, if you were trying to move past somebody, you would say, oh, pardon me. So I did that. I was in school and I was passing students and I said, perdóname. And, you know, I got that kind of giggle and they're like, oh no, teacher, you say con permiso instead of perdóname. So,
I actually say perdóname for I'm sorry.
well, so this is what I'm going to talk about it further. So this is in Colombia, you know, so different types depending on where you're from and which type of Spanish you speak.
I'm sorry, Katie. I'm going to stop them.
No, that's okay. Because Abrashka, it's something that I was going to ask you about later in the presentation. So, so fast forward to a year, and then that's when I moved over to Spain. And so I had these, you know, I'm sorry, say que pena, and for, you know, moving past people, con permiso. And I had a similar situation where I needed to say I'm sorry, but it wasn't a big deal. So I said que pena. And I was with a friend who he was from England, but he had been living in Spain for a very long time. And he said, "What did you just say?" And I said, "Que pena." And he said, "Why would you ever say that?" And he's like, "You should say disculpe." And for me, that was always hard to say. And so I kind of avoid saying it. So I would say que pena or perdona. And he said, "No, you should definitely use disculpa in this situation." And he kind of explained it. And then I had another similar situation where I was waiting at the train tracks, and the man in front of me had dropped his scarf. So I yelled out, "Perdona." And he turned around, and I got that familiar look like, "What did you just say to me?" And he explained, like, "No, in this situation, you should definitely say disculpa instead of perdona." So, I was learning these words with this input, and they were explicitly being taught to me, but not exactly in a classroom setting. And they were in this real life situations. So how can you transfer these real life situations into the classroom? Because what else do I have here? So there was this one article by Thorsten Huth, and it was titled "Pragmatics Revisited." So it was teaching with natural language data. And he specifically compared the English versus German complement response sequences. And so he had this one quote that I liked. First, a large range of pragmatic features is in fact teachable in the classroom. Second, explicit instruction in pragmatics tends to be more effective than mere exposure. So in other words, L2 pragmatics needs to be explained. And this is what I agree with. And Elaine kind of mentioned it too in her thing. So pragmatics can be taught in the classroom, but I agree with her, and I don't think that it's enough, that it needs to be taught also outside of the classroom. So how can you accomplish this? And this was kind of something that Deanna talked about, and both of the programs that I was in Colombia and in Spain, I was a cultural ambassador or a language assistant. So my job in the classroom, it wasn't to teach the grammar. They had the local teachers that had better grammar than I did and knew how to teach it. So my role in the classroom was to kind of, help with the pragmatics aspect. And I have a few examples. So one of the teachers, well, the rest isn't important on the thing. One of the teachers, she, after the kids did something good, and usually you would say, "Oh, nice job, well done," or what would she say? She would say, "Oh," if you said "very good," "Yeah, very good," with an answer, she would say, "Oh, very well, very well." And I kind of had to take her aside. And so good and well, I think it would kind of be similar in Spanish to bien and bueno. So I kind of had to explain to her, "Oh, in this situation, you should use good instead of very well." And then another situation, and it's funny, in Colombia, when you walk into the room and you say, "Oh, how are you, class?" They kind of respond in unison, "I'm fine, thank you, and you?" And it always was funny to me, because if you were to ask somebody here in the States and you said, "Oh, how are you?" and they would say, "I'm fine," it would most likely mean that they probably weren't fine, when you get that response. So one lesson that we did was how you can respond with other responses than "I'm fine." But I think the hard thing about teaching this in the classroom is, what about, the teachers who are teaching a second language that's not their native language, and they don't have that pragmatic competence. And so how can they teach that in the classroom? So I think, like, with the cultural ambassador and the language assistant, it's helpful, having native speakers in the classroom. And I was hoping maybe somebody else would touch upon this in their presentation. But other than that, how is it expected for non-native speakers to teach this pragmatic competence when they don't have it? So I don't know if anybody has any responses for that, or.
It's interesting, Katie, because and it's not just you, it's like everyone, it's like every single linguist ever, of differentiating between the real world and the classroom. Because as far as I understand it, I don't go off to a pocket dimension when I go into a classroom. Like, I'm still in the real world. I'm still learning how to use language. And especially when it's from a native speaker of the language, that is 100% real world exposure to, I mean, they may be using constructed situations, but they're also teaching from a place that's informed by how they know to use the language. And I think you raised a really good point of what to do with a person who's not a native speaker. I would argue that we're still getting real world pragmatics. It's just through the filter of like a lingua franca situation almost, or a foreign language situation. So what your question really seems to be like is like, oh, how can we get the most immersive, authentic experience to whatever culture we want to visit, country we want to live in order to take that on? Because as you've shown, I mean, let's say even if you had, right, a native Colombian Spanish speaker who was your teacher, you still would have been screwed when you went to Spain. You wouldn't have known disculpe, right? Disculpe or disculpe?
Disculpe.
Disculpe. You still wouldn't have known that. You still would have been like taught by your friend from England. And then you still would have been taught by the guy that you gave the scarf to. So it's kind of like, it's like a catch-22, because I think we have to make the effort in spite of whatever gaps that we're going to have, because there are going to be gaps no matter what we try to do. But we have to just, I think, offset it always with a bit of a caveat when we talk to the students, like, look, in this particular culture, right, if we're talking about Colombian Spanish, this is really how you would go about doing this. But you may find other Spanish speakers will phrase it differently. So just always be aware. I think that's the best we can possibly do, because even the best native speaker or teacher is not going to stand there in front of you and go down the, like, I don't even know how many countries use Spanish as their main language, different cultures' way of pragmatically using words to say, excuse me.
So I try to do that. So like, I think that I took advantage of the fact that we're in the United States and I've been in such a melting pot. So like, for example, I lived in New Jersey, like near Newark, Elizabeth. I don't know if you ever know the area, but like my class, my high school, there was basically only one person that I knew was actually American. Everybody else was like Portuguese, Colombian, Chilean, from everywhere. There's so many different ways. So like, what I started to do was in my own classes is I mean, a lot of us know Quizlet, right? So for example, when I did toilet, retrete, inodoro, hay muchas maneras de decir inodoro. There's so many ways of saying a toilet. So what I do is I give them all the ones I know, and I try to research any other ones from other countries, and then just be like, whichever sounds more like that you will actually understand and remember, that's the one that you should remember. It doesn't matter how you say it. It's just so you be aware that the fact, and I always go back to this. In English, there's other countries that speak English, but use the English very different than you do. So you might not understand them. So it's just like opening their mind to understanding that there's 13 different Spanish speaking countries and we all say things very different. And for me, in being a Puerto Rican with the Spanglish, like I don't say centro comercial, I say mall, but I need to remember that other countries say very different. So I try my best to do it because it just bothers me to just give them one option, even though they'll be like, oh my God, Mr. T's, but there's so many different ones. But it's just giving them that awareness that there's so many different ways of using one word.
Right. But that's the thing, right? Just telling them like it's not necessarily just going to be this one way, because I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's possible to pragmatically teach how to use Spanish for the 20 plus countries that speak Spanish. I just Googled it.
And so if you go back to the first part of the class, when we put things on a continuum, you remember grammar, pragmatic, and sociolinguistic. What Katie touched upon is really like at the end of continuum with sociolinguistics perspective. And I think that's the beauty of learning an additional language, is you have the chance to have, diverse encounters, and you take it as the learning opportunities, and in this case outside the classroom. Now with the the inside the classroom, there are some limitation, and you do point out in your presentation, so everybody can see that Katie also touched upon the disadvantages of a kind of functional syllabus. Functional discourse syllabus emerged, saying that you can always teach a linguistic unit with its function, but again, it's not always authentic. And part of it is because you need to place the curriculum in the syllabus to be suitable with the current language proficiency of the student. So, the greeting scenario is so familiar. So you start with the beginners, English beginners. So it's very difficult to explain to them in English language that, like, how are you can be responded with different way, like what's up, how you doing, because you cannot immerse them in that authenticity from the very beginning. So one thing that I write down here is the reinforcement. So if you think that, oh, it is authentic, and then it can be understandable and comprehensible to the student with that certain level, then you need to kind of, not just only introduce the greeting scenario at the beginning level, but also kind of enhance that pragmatic knowledge when the student come to intermediate, and repeat again when student come to advanced level, so they can become more sophisticated in language use. But that is a way that pragmatic knowledge needs to be reinforced again and again in the classroom setting. Another way is to organize it with some specific task. So Yuka and Andy gonna touch upon the practical kind of task-based design in order to incorporate pragmatic knowledge in the classroom. Okay, so Yuka, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm gonna share my screen now.
Deanna, thanks for telling me that, because I didn't know that Morocco and the Philippines have Spanish as their official language. So I used to always just think it was South America, Equatorial Guinea, and Africa, and that's it. There you go.
I mean, and the thing of it is, that's just 20 different countries, right? That doesn't even begin to take into account all the dialects.
Exactly.
Then it rockets off the charts. And then, like, within Spain, there's probably more different ways to say excuse me than just what Katie learned, depending on what part of Spain you're in.
Yeah, most of my students are like, I just want to say like the Puerto Ricans and just say them all. So.
Okay, guys, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Cool. So today I'm gonna talk about a teaching technique. It is called input processing instruction and some practices. And at the end, I will also mention some emerging teaching techniques which combine instructor and some technological methods, like use computer and also the instructor together to teach pragmatics. Okay, so first, here I briefly mentioned explicit and implicit approaches, which is well explained in Elaine's presentation. So I'll just read it very quickly as a quick review, okay? So for explicit approach, it is referred to a direct explanation of pragmatics knowledge, and it is usually combined with practice in class. And implicit approaches, it stresses an environment that provides input and practice to help learners naturally develop the understanding of pragmatics knowledge and the way to apply it. So the explicit and implicit, they have some different stress, although their goal is to teach pragmatics. And here, this is a very tracked pace slide. So I'll just make things brief and clear. So I will talk about the awareness or oriented input process instruction in the following slides. So this is a instruction which instruction which is designed as a continuum between the absolute explicit and the absolute implicit extremes, because some researchers realized that there is no we should not just follow one approach, because both approach has their advantages, and it would be very helpful if we can combine these two together. And the extent to which the target of the instruction is made over to the learners determines the positioning of that kind of instruction between explicit and implicit poles. In the following, I'm sorry, I'm kind of, okay. So in the following study that I will introduce, the author applied a approach, which is the awareness-oriented input based approach. This approach is actually created and applied originally in teaching grammar, and there's a Japanese researcher who find that this might also be an effective approach in teaching pragmatics. So here you can see a chart. I listed 2 types of input-based approaches. And this is used for originally for teaching grammar. And I will briefly introduce what these 2 types are, so you can have a sense in the following introduction of teaching pragmatics. So one type of this approach is structured input. In this kind of approach, students' response is necessary, and the response can take various forms, such as true or false, check a box, select the correct picture, or draw a diagram, or perform an action. So the student's response can be really various, and teachers and researchers can determine which response is appropriate according to the context. And in this approach, the first attention is related to meaning, and then students need to notice the form and function of the grammatical structure, and finally, error identification will also be stressed here. Okay, so this is the first type of input-based approach. And another type is consciousness raising or problem-solving approach. So in this approach, a specific linguistic feature will be isolated, and students will be encouraged to use their intellectual resources to understand that target feature. And also learners will be required to verbalize rules describing the grammatical structures in question. Okay, so this is how input-based approach is applied in studies about grammar. And now let's look at a research which applied this input-based approach in teaching pragmatics. So this researcher's name is Takimoto. So based on the studies of explicit approach to and also implicit approach to teaching pragmatics, Takimoto investigated the effect of input processing instruction on learning request forms of L2 English. So in this study, only one speech act is focused, which is request forms. And the study involves 3 types of input-based interventions. One is structured input tasks with explicit pragmatics information, and another one is problem-solving tasks, and the third one is structured input tasks without explicit pragmatics information. And a control group is also included here as a can be like compared with the other three groups to see whether the approach is effective or not. These tasks required students to evaluate the appropriateness of request forms in a dialogue. And there were also 4 assessment tasks at the end. They are a discourse completion task, a role play task, a written appropriateness judgment task, and a listening appropriateness judgment task. So both written and listening and speaking version is included here. And the result showing and the results showed that compared with the control group, all these 3 experimental groups' performance improved, but there was no significant difference of performance among the 3 groups in the assessment. So this study provide a strong support for the benefit of input processing instruction. Yeah. And this is another study, which is also from this researcher talking model. And in this task, this researcher examining the repetition as a input processing task, examining like the effectiveness of repetition. So there are 2 types of repetition defined in this research. One is same task and another one is similar task repetition. So the learners who took the same tasks repeated the same input structured activity, but students in similar task repetition, they need to apply the input structure activities into a different situation to examine how well they learned how well they can like perform from pragmatics perspective. And also a control group is included here, and students in this control group will receive no instruction at all. Assessment is also applied. It is a acceptability adjustment test mirroring target request forms in a dialogue requests. So the result suggests that the 2 experimental groups outperformed the control group in 2 assessment tasks. However, the same task group performed better than the similar task group on producing requests, no matter from the correct, like the accuracy or fluency or the varieties that the learners can provide in these tasks. So this result revealed that same task repetition can help learners better understand the activity, and students from this group can also better apply their knowledge of request forms into target scenarios than the other group. Okay, so this is the 2 studies that applied input processing task in teaching pragmatics. And next, I will introduce some instructional materials and resources. Teaching pragmatics includes several different elements like social context, functional language use, and interaction. I think these 3 is also reflected in the today's presentation. And here I want to introduce first introduce a framework which is designed to develop pragmatics and intercultural competences. So during researching and reflecting, pragmatics concepts were introduced to learners. Learners also needed to gather pragmatics data of their first language and then analyze the data referring to social variables. There are 6 stages in this framework. They are researching, reflecting, reflecting, receiving, reasoning, rehearsing, and revising. In the later 2 stages, learners received explicit instruction on how-to pragmatics acts and also analyze how-to data in the same way with how they analyze the data of L1. And the last 2 stages, rehearsing and revising, are about practice. So learners applied their pragmatics knowledge in communicative tasks and then received feedback about their performance. So through these 6 stages, the framework cooperates with several elements of teaching pragmatics, like cultural comparison, explicit instruction, pragmatics awareness raising, and various pragmatics situations, practice and feedback. So this framework can provide a considerable way to the future pragmatics teaching. And there's 6 stages in this framework, I think give me some inspiration in teaching pragmatics. Okay, and in these slides, here are some studies exploring the use of technology in pragmatics teaching. So in addition to traditional teaching techniques, these studies have explored like using computer, use like some software or some computer-based courses to teaching pragmatics. For example, the first one, so these researchers designed a computer program for Arabic learners to practice pragmatics expressions through answering pre-recorded dialogues, and then they will get feedback from the program. So in this study, the rule of this program is as important as instructor. And the teaching resources is all uploaded to this program, and students in this video. Oops. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Why my screen? Then can you see my screen?
Yes. Yes, we can still see your screen.
My screen totally black. Why?
Okay, then let's say so.
Oh, okay, your screen sharing is paused. Oh, okay, I'm not sure which like.
Can you reshare it again?
Yeah. Okay.
Let me just
resume sharing. Okay. Is it good now?
Oh, no.
No.
Let me stop. Okay, can you share it again?
Yeah. Hold on. Just start. Okay, start my video. I'm sorry, I don't know.
It's okay.
Okay, I'll share screen. Cool.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I was talking about, the second, I think I was talking about the second study. So in the second study, this is a computer-based course, which is developed to examine the effectiveness on teaching Japanese reactive tokens. And learners, they will watch conversations recorded by Japanese native speakers, and they are required to identify the reactive tokens from the conversation. And then they will practice reactive tokens that they have learned. And in this study, the learners also shows higher awareness of reactive tokens. Reactive token, okay, are missed, and their awareness is also improved after the course. So the above mentioned studies support the effectiveness of explicit approaches and also provide us a potential benefit of teaching pragmatics with mixed techniques. So instructors and computers, they can, like both of them can provide some advantages to teaching pragmatics. Okay, so this is all for my presentation, and I'm sorry about the I'm sorry about the
Sorry. It's
yeah.
okay. It's okay. Technical issues. So thank you, Yuka. I think so everybody, if you want to check, the highlight of the presentation, I'm doing it in the chat box, just like Yuka presentation. I feel like she pointed out very helpful task-based strategies that can be used in a classroom. And not only that, she said that the researchers testify these kind of strategies and these are the results. So if you want to, especially look into that in teaching sequence and input processing, or also incorporating technology into teaching pragmatics, then I will send the link of today's presentation to everyone and also upload the presentation so you can, review it again. So another
can I add a little bit? Thank you, Han. You have a great summary about my presentation. So I just want to add a little bit to my to this presentation. So I think I don't give very detailed information in my section, because I instead of providing those detailed details about techniques, I want to cover more techniques as much as possible. So if you're interested in any of them and you think what I provided is not sufficient, you can just email me and I will send you the reference list to you. And I hope that would be helpful. Thank you, Han.
Thank you, Yuka. And so we will come to the last presentation of today. Thank you for everyone. I know that you can, if you have anything to do, you just can leave, because I will, provide the link to everybody. But if you stay with us, we will listen to Andy, and he will talk about the project-based approach when it comes to pragmatic instruction. Okay, Andy, please. Andy, unmute yourself first.
Hi, everybody. I'm Andy. I do not have a title for this presentation yet. I'm kind of, feeling like title TBD is kind of cool, but it might change. Tim's giving me a thumbs up. All right. Thanks, buddy. All right. So today, rather than really talking about how to teach pragmatics, I want to briefly discuss how pragmatics, systemic functional linguistics, and genre-based pedagogy can be incorporated in a classroom to potentially examine the way that temporary speech communities use oral language to communicate, and then to track the lexical grammatical features that they're using, the formulaic language, and all these novel utterances to understand how it carries over between tasks and, if at all, how and if at all it gets used in the written discourse. My wheelhouse is more in writing, but since taking this class, I'm starting to see a lot of overlap, which is super neat. Okay, it's an ongoing project, so it's not perfect. If you have any ideas, you can chime in. If you want to play devil's advocate and throw me a curveball, don't hesitate. Notice all of these funky little phrases I'm using. I have peppered the entire presentation with them. Okay, so here are some questions that I feel like I've identified. I'm not sure, and this is like, I try and go as big as I can in the beginning, and then, you know, get down to like what's actually necessary. So I don't know if all of these are necessary yet, but if I don't get it out of my head, it stays in there and it drives me crazy. My big question is how contemporary English as a lingua franca speech communities benefit from each other's prior experiences and linguistic knowledge? Is it through new lexical units and phrases? And how does their previously acquired linguistic code, how is that invigorated? And importantly, how do these small groups develop the building blocks for developing their pragmatic competence as children, as second language learners? How does the teacher use the experiences and transfer them to the written discourse? What's the teacher role? Is it a facilitator? Is it an instruction? Is it balanced? What happens there? And how does that teacher facilitator get integrated into that small temporary speech community without forcing themselves into it? Because otherwise it stops becoming an English as a lingua franca community. And it's all about whatever the teacher says is right about the language use, and that sucks. And finally, how do I tie all this together? So let's look at my next slide. I'm pulling on a lot of theory here. I'm looking at 5 different perspectives to try and explain and code this research. I'm not opposed to adding more. If I miss something, let me know. If you think one of them can be bumped, let me know. I'm into it. So I'm looking at systemic functional linguistics, genre-based pedagogy, the sociocognitive approach, and positioning theory, frame semantics, and project-based learning. I'm going to talk about each one of those as briefly as I can because I know we all have things to do. So SFL is a theory of language. I don't know how many people are familiar with it. I did my master's in SFL, and I've spent years working with it in universities in Japan and K through 12 schools here in the United States. It's a theory of language use based on language function. It helps us describe syntax. However, the focus is on what language does and how it does so based within a social context, both invigorating it and being constrained by it. So these are both 2 keywords that I think we've heard in this class. And, you know, when I heard them, my brain went, bing, there's a connection there. Let's see. I'm going to give you guys a quote here from Halliday. He said, when children learn language, they're not simply engaging in one kind of learning among many. Rather, they're learning the foundation of learning itself. So my interpretation of this is that children learn languages holistically. They acquire this data set, which is immediately put to use, but it's code-based. So when they're engaging in an action using language, they're not solely responsible, nor can we expect their interlocutors are passive participants. So it's in this act of community language learning that they're learning about other important aspects of interaction. And I believe that this is where we find part of those building blocks for pragmatic competence. Can I prove it yet? No. Am I going to try? Yeah. And I also want to bring this back to one of the things that we talk about in elementary schools. We teach children how to read in kindergarten and first grade. That's really when we learn how to read. From second grade, we start reading to learn. So there's another overlap there, I think. Where are we? One takeaway for this, though, is that we learn language, and through it, we learn everything else. And I believe that the opposite is true. We learn everything else as we learn language. So humans, we all seek to mean. Meaning is this essential thing that we all want to do. And so we participate in the semiotic process of meaning making. Yet children are something special because they're learning language while they learn through language while simultaneously learning language. It's this process that happens at the same time. So for this reason, I feel like SFL is a really logical choice when considering how and why to teach language through language to and for children. Let's move on because I'm running out of time. Genre-based pedagogy. Swales in 1990 said that language use in a group is a form of social behavior. So I love this, in a group, language use in a group. I'm looking at temporary speech communities, groups, is a form of social behavior. And that discourse is a means of maintaining and extending that group's knowledge, right? And of imitating new members in that group. So that discourse is epistemic or constitutive of the group's knowledge. So it's all got to come together there. Hyland said, knowledge is socially constructed through language. What does this have to do with genre? Well, genre is a framework for language usage based on exemplars. It relies on a model. It relies on co-construction and independent construction. It supports writers. It's typically used for writing. It supports writers with a structured yet generalized framework for writing. It has a communicative purpose. Swales also believed that an approach to the analysis of genre should consider examples of different genres and how they can be made accessible through this genre analysis. And in genre analysis, he said that rhetoric and linguistics combined explain genre as grounded in a shared communicative purpose. Again, I'm pulling these words that really tie things together for me. And I think a shared communicative purpose definitely does that. It talks about temporary communities, temporary speech communities. Let's move on because it's already 7:25. Slide 6, common ground, background knowledge and actual situational context. We don't need to talk about this too much, guys. We've been talking about it for the last 15 weeks. However, I don't think we've talked anything about positioning, which is really cool. It's something I just discovered. Positioning or alignment is a position that an interlocutor takes during a social situation, right? And it has a lot to do with genre, because if we're taking a social situation, then we have to know what's expected within those generalized rules, right? So it's just what Deanna said, right? Like when you need to be rude, you need to know how to do it within that situation. Where am I? Yes, positioning. So this guy Tannen, he says that alignment is how ways of speaking demonstrate and create context and relationship among speakers. So when we position ourselves, we do so with the constraint of a previously established set of social guidelines. Now, for the most part, L1 speech communities have normalized a lot of that. So for a lot of us, we already know it. But second language learners are coming into it with a different set of norms. So how do they position themselves within that context? Alignment allows us to frame things, or as Davis and Harris explain, positioning theories, they say it's a discursive practice through which each participant positions the other, positions themselves, and all this is happening while being positioned. Their engagement in the conversation conveys an interactual meaning while they negotiate identities for themselves and for the world around them. So within all these different genres, we as teachers position ourselves in relation to our students who simultaneously do the same. all while we position ourselves within the actual situational context of the classroom, our own individual and communal background knowledges and prior and post experiences that we're going to draw upon. Basic interactional context. I thought this, so yeah, I'm not going to talk about SCA. Basic interactional context. This says, the professor said that we all have this basic interactional context. It's a system. It's not language-based. It's not culture-based necessarily. But we all have it. Duh. When we think about the context of children, though, we have to recognize that this is in flux. It's dynamic. It's in a constant state of change because they're constantly positioning themselves and realigning themselves. So for L's, that's affected not only by their target language, but also the language in the schools, the language of the teachers, and the language of their classmates. And then their home language and home culture is also affecting that. So we can assume that L's in an elementary school are in the actual process of developing their own BIC, right? Yeah, it's human condition, but it fits in. Now, I've added another thing on here, and this was sort of last minute. This was enhancement through genre. Ifantito did some research connecting genre and pragmatics that showed explicit genre-based instruction had significant positive effects on the development of genre-focused, convention-specific discourse. So, according to him, genre and pragmatics are connected, but there still needs to be more research conducted to determine to what extent these two concepts relate. And I'm gonna try and figure that out. Wish me luck. Frame semantics is another new one I found. Totally new to me. In the mid-70s, this guy named Fillmore asked, what leads users to recognize communicative events as being situated within this specific genre? Now, again, I'm going to say like events, these situations. Again, it all for me connects to pragmatics. So much of these common lexical units it just bounce back and forth for me. Later on, to an extent, this guy named Partridge answered this by arguing that pragmatics plays a much larger role on the notion of genre through concepts such as prototype theory, intertextuality theory, and inheritance theory. We don't have a lot of time. I'm not going to go into it. I'll share my notes with you guys. But the big thing here, oh, no, this is good. Intertextuality I want to talk about. Bogrand and Dressler describe this as the facts which make the utilization of one text dependent upon the knowledge of one or more previously encountered texts. This sounds like salience to me. Call me crazy. So to further that, this guy Griffith in 1987, he said, if someone says, the word fan belt makes me think of strawberries, okay? Now, that can be written off as a quirk or an aberration. However, if I use the word fan belt a couple pages from now, there's a possibility, however faint it might be, that one or more of you will instantly think of strawberries. Salience. This is describing salience. And connects to one of my all-time favorite quotes, the most probable out of all possible. If he was here, maybe I would get bonus points for that. I don't know, probably not. So there's no such thing as a single meaning. There's no correct or right meaning of a text, but the individual's own reading or their intertextuality is what's defining that and constraining. So different cultures, societies, individuals classify and understand the world in different ways, blah, 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 blah. Inheritance, simply put, allows for writers and readers and interlocutors of a means to access the information they already have about a model, okay? And link the model to their previous experience. Linking models to their previous experience. I feel like, again, we're hitting on connections. So that's a whole lot of theory, and I'm sorry. You're probably wondering where I'm going with this or where I'm trying to take you. Well, my background is this slide 8. Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, my background is in SFL and genre-based pedagogy, not in pragmatics. However, I'm super into it now because it's really cool. And I believe that they all align. There's alignment here. So with such an alignment, how can I use this to teach? How can writing and speaking come together and elevate, invigorate the experiences of L2 students? Not only is this a description of what teaching pragmatics in the classroom could look like, it's also sort of the beginning of, sorry, my kid's jumping in here. It's also the beginning of what I think is the proposal for my pilot, a project that's taken quite a few twists and turns over the last 2.5 years. Bear with me, stop me if I'm wrong, or if it's been done before. But I believe that small temporary English as a lingua franca speech communities in elementary schools are worth observing closely. I believe that their pragmatic competencies are in the act of developing, not in one language or the other language, but in this inherent system. So how do I record this? How do I get that data? How does that happen? So
Mic them.
What's that?
Mic them and walk away.
Oh, you better believe it. You better believe it. I got my room rigged for sound and video. No, I really do. I actually have like professional microphones in my room and nice cameras. And I used to work for a university, so I had a rather large research budget and I spent it on technology like any fool would. So here's my concept, okay? And this is a little bit taken from a research conducted by Kexias, Sanders, and Pomerantz. What happens when speech communities come together to do something, right? Will we see a transfer of formulaic language from one student to another? Will they be able to use that within the constraints of specific speech acts and genres? So rather than, taking a topic, which is what they did in their research, they took a topic that was, broad enough where no one would really be an expert in it, and they recorded that conversation to see what happened. What I want to do is I want to give students an activity. I want to give them a project. And as Deanna said, I want to walk out of the room and see what happens. I'm not really going to walk out of the room. I want to be a facilitator. I love my kids.
I mean, you always could, Andy. It might lead to some interesting results if you just take a call outside of the room for 5 minutes and see what they say.
It's so hard though, because I'm working with like 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old kids, and like it's generally frowned upon.
You're not gonna have matches.
To just
it's okay.
leave them. We'll see. Just for you, okay? What goes into their talk about the activity, right? And when they're participating in it, how does their language function? Are they going to use these lexical units from the discussion and the project-based learning that they do in their writing later on? Is one kid going to take some formulaic language from another kid and use that as like, how they structure their writing from the genre awareness of some other kid? I don't know. I think so, but to what extent? All right. So I'm proposing a longitudinal study. I'm an elementary school teacher, so I have data out the ears and access like crazy. So I want to look at what happens over the course of a year in a project-based learning classroom with pragmatics focused and genre constrained, to see how that affects formulaic language, novel utterances, novel utterances, there's no page number, novel utterances, and I didn't finish it. Okay, next slide. So I work in a rural low incidence district. I teach K through 5. I've got kids coming from lots of different classrooms. I've been teaching in person since September, by the way, which has been hell on earth, but also really wonderful because my kids aren't, suffering behind a Zoom screen like everyone else in the country. Sorry. They come together with me for their ELL block. And these kids know each other. We've been working together for the past 3 years, but they all come from different linguistic and cultural backgrounds. I have Spanish speakers from El Salvador, Colombia, Mexico, the Dominican Republic, and Ecuador. I have students who speak Turkish, Portuguese, and Gujarati. I've got a wide range of different language users. wow, what an opportunity. What's going to happen there? And every year, every month, every week, new kids come. That's the reality with this population. And it's also the fastest growing population of any other population of students in the United States. So we're all in the right field, guys. Job security. Where am I going? Where am I going? So the teacher facilitator, I'm an American English native speaker. I speak Japanese fluently. I lived in Japan for 15 years. I lived in China for 2. I lived in Montreal for 2. We can assume that this teacher's pragmatics has already been invigorated by his 2nd, 3rd, and 4th languages to some extent by these experiences. But I also think that it'll be invigorated more by what happens interacting with these students. Slide 10. Rationale. All right, I don't have any notes on here for you, but I'll talk about what I want to say, and then we'll be pretty much done. I think that prototype genre analysis as a model needs to follow something like this. It needs to have a model of writing or speaking that aligns with the previously normalized framework. So the characteristics, syntactic regularity, lexicogrammatical features for a specific context. And so, you know, I'm also wondering how to fit all this together. I'm going to get all mixed up. So I think that what's happening is that through project-based learning, we can see how genre and pragmatics interact with temporary speech communities. And I think that's going to be really interesting. And I also don't think it's been documented. You know, I want to see how, you know, these socially dynamic aspects of the community get recorded. I want to figure out how to code that. And, you know, I mean, one of the most important things is that I'm not going to make this grade based. I want to see what they do and how they do it and record that language. And then look through that lens, you know, to see what kind of transfers is happening. And I think, you know, project-based learning, genre, and functional linguistics are all fantastic ways to invigorate student pragmatic competencies. You know, it's just how we approach it. So I've got some references for you here. There's a whole bunch. And I'll share this with the group. Thank you all for listening. Y'all are awesome. Thanks for sticking around with me until much later in the class.
So because we at the, you know, beginning phase of your project, so, you know, we hope to attain your pilot defense, dissertation defense on that. But I just want to kind of like summarize how Andy fit in the line, you know, like all of the previous presentation, we focus on how to bring pragmatic, what pragmatic means, what to teach pragmatics into a second language classroom. But Andy just also put forward the idea of how to teach intercultural pragmatics for, you know, student and language users from different cultural background, how you can teach that emergent context and emergent interactional norms. So I hope that this session gonna give you very helpful ideas for your final project. You either can look into one tiny topic of pragmatics, or you can, you know, look into the teachability of pragmatics in second language, or teaching pragmatic intercultural pragmatics, right? So like I say, if you have any question for the final, I'm here. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Ron.
Thank you.